in them, you'll see some of the really short bills actually have a corresponding note that will say the intent of this bill is to whatever, you know, and actually in common language explain what it is about. And it was interesting the other day when we were speaking here on residential tenancies, the minister said that in her final comments I had mentioned that the bill was very legalistic, and when you look at it, especially where it's talking about taking out a clause in an old bill and substituting with something new, it's really hard without having both bills before you and really almost being a lawyer. It's really hard to understand exactly what the intent is of different sections of the bill. And it's our job here in opposition to do just that. We have to go through it. We have to figure it out, Mr. Speaker, because we, frankly, are not confident that every clause that's brought forward by the government is going to be there for the right reasons or be the right thing to do. So we need to question it. That's our job, and I know the members in the government realize that because they were effective members in opposition as well, many of them. And so they know that we have to try and take the time, understand it, and then come back with what we think are proper amendments, or, you know, on some occasions, give it our full and unequivocal support. And that does happen sometimes. But, Mr. Speaker, it makes our job a lot harder when there are no corresponding notes that explain this. And I was going to tell you that the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations, actually in her final comments had replied to me not to worry because there would be a plain English version of that bill made available. Plain language. Yes, thank you. The minister has, yeah, but to make it clear, so clear, everyday English, that especially in the case of that bill, that would be many people are tenants, many people would not have a technical background. And Mr. Speaker, you know that in this province, 40% of Nova Scotians have trouble reading and writing. And that is actually not higher than the country. It's about on par with Canada, and it is a real crime. It's a tremendous loss for our province in terms of the ability for average everyday Nova Scotians. 40% of those people having difficulty reading. And there's a scale that the Government of Canada uses for literacy. The top level 5 are people who have university education who can read technical material. And definitely these acts fall into that level. They're difficult. And, you know, I'm very fortunate, Mr. Speaker, to have been a graduate of Dalhousie University, and that gave me an opportunity to do this sort of reading. I have an MBA from that university. I think now, had I known I was coming to this House, I might have tried to do more law courses in order to be better prepared for the kind of work before us. That might have helped us more. But, you know, we are fortunate, the members of this House who can read this kind of material. More law courses, yeah. I said, in order to be more effective in the legislature, I think lawyers have a certain advantage. It may be their ability to debate endlessly. That may be good. We have a few lawyers here, but there are fewer lawyers here than there were in the past. Mr. Speaker, we see more teachers, more educators. But my point is that the minister herself, in talking about the Residential Tenancies Act, which has a parallel here to Bill 124, she said, we will come up with a plain language version, and that means that any tenant and any landlord in the province would be able to pick up the version that is really designed for them to understand what the intent is of the Act. And as a legislator and as somebody who's here today at the early stages of looking at this Act respecting Nova Scotia land surveyors, I would really like to see that we would have a version that explained, even in the short crib notes that you'd get in some other bills. And that should be made, and I'd like to, right here today, make it a request of government that we ask our Legislative Council to always provide those kind of explanatory notes. I think they'd help any Nova Scotian who goes online. We now have a tremendous amount of information available at our fingertips, Mr. Speaker. By going online, clicking on the legislative site under government, you can look at any bills that are making their way through the legislature. You can read bills that have been passed. And, you know, how much more helpful is it if there's those explanatory notes so that students and academics and Nova Scotians, frankly, who need to know And I'll go back to the Residential Tenancies Act. There are thousands of Nova Scotians who are renting and living in rental accommodation. They may need to know what their rights are, and when they have difficulty, they may need to know exactly, right back to the Act, whether or not they have the right to go to the Residential Tenancies Act, or whether their rights have been impinged in some way. So, you know, I think it's very important that those explanatory notes begin to make their way into every piece of legislation that we see before us, because frankly, Mr. Speaker, in my early remarks here on this bill and beginning to talk on it, I am struck by the fact that there are 24 pages beginning with definitions and so on, and not one explanatory note to give a little bit more context to the work that's before us here today. It's interesting, to note that it's a replacement act, so we're updating an act for a profession that has been active in our province for a very long time. Certainly from the earliest days of mapping our city of Halifax when we were first founded, we know that the surveyors have been active. I know that the earlier speaker, the member from Cape Breton North, actually was speaking about the founding of the city, and 1749, I believe it was the year that Halifax was founded as a counterbalance to Louisbourg, which was part of the French colonies and was a very powerful fort for the French people and French government. So it was decided to come here and have a military presence in Halifax on this wonderful harbour, and in order to create that counterbalance in power at that time, which was really an international power base. But in founding the city of Halifax, we have the plans to this day of how they mapped out our city on a grid and used that to go forward in creating the city of Halifax, which is now today the city of Halifax. So we have had surveyors doing this sort of planning and work from the earliest time of our government here and our people in English, certainly in English-speaking Nova Scotia, because our history went back before that with land grants and Acadian farmers. But it's very important. Obviously, the ownership of land and the accurate description of land is very important. And I'll get into that more, Mr. Speaker, as we talk further around the profession of land surveying, the training of land surveyors, and the act that's before us, which is going to govern how they behave, how they interact with the public, how they maintain their professional integrity, which is so important. And through an act here in the legislature, professional integrity is a big part of it. It's a big part of what they are standing by, and a big part of what we look for as we accept certain professions for that very important role of getting I would say, the honor of having an act in their own name, and also the responsibility of their members and their professional body maintaining that high standard of work ethic and control and professionalism that we expect from people that are doing business in Nova Scotia. And I should say to begin with that certainly we have tremendous professionals in that area. I know that there are many people who've worked hard to see these changes come forward. And I think, as I said in the very beginning, there is not a corner of the province that isn't responsible for maintaining records. Every municipality relies on those records and land ownership and actually property descriptions in order to raise their provincial taxes. But just before I go there, Mr. Speaker, I want to make sure that it's very clear to the government that I believe no bill should come before us without the explanatory notes. I think every one of us, and we are not all Harvard lawyers or even lawyers, as I'd said. And what I'd like to see is that because we represent the people of Nova Scotia and come from all walks of life, that it is made very clear what kind of legislation we're passing. And those explanatory notes in plain language would help everybody. And they might mean that some departments don't have to go to the effort of writing an entire separate version for the general public to really understand. You know, as I said, Mr. Speaker, it is a real travesty that we still have 40% of Nova Scotians with literacy problems. And that can, be anything from, the most severe cases where they really can't read and write. But it's said that many people are impeded on the job because they can't read instructions, they can't read technical manuals. And in fact, even at an earlier level, we worry on the healthcare side that people can't understand the information given to them when they get a prescription filled, for example. And I know that going in there, I've noticed over the last number of years, I think most of the pharmacists are doing this now. They'll give you a big printout basically about that drug that you've just been prescribed, which will tell you all the adverse effects and exactly what would be good for you or not good for you, and what to watch for, when to come back and see your doctor, even how to properly take those drugs. And so it's very nice. Come join me. As I say, Mr. Speaker, I think the understanding of basic information that will keep us healthy is so important. And this, of course, is a mission for the Minister of Education and for each and every one of us in our own domains to be promoting education and literacy, because, as I said, how can we possibly protect members of the public when they have difficulty reading the kind of information that is before us? And in every single act that passes here, there are people out there that are impacted. There are individuals who are going to feel the impact of the kind of ideas that are put forward or motions. And so through this act, which is 24 pages, as I said, Mr. Speaker, and covers a lot of ground, it has 78 different clauses, and it actually is it is replacing an older act, because I did find a couple of references to the former act saying that the former act is going to stay in effect until this new act is passed and becomes law. So that is an important fact, that we are actually here replacing an act that I think is about 60 years old. Mr. Speaker, I think while we're here in the legislature, it's important that we do look at some of the major challenges before us. And literacy is certainly one that I think is paramount. We've been talking a lot in this session of the legislature about the economy and about job losses, or plants that might find that they're no longer competitive and they're moving from Nova Scotia. And a good part of what makes us competitive is a literate population. And having such 11 universities actually in our province is a tremendous advantage, but it means that we have about 40% of the population that have higher education and are really well trained and able to handle the most difficult literacy issues and material. But then we have 40% that have really fallen by the wayside and don't have basic literacy. And I think that's why our legislature should be striving, not just with bills, but with all the information that we prepare, with our own website, with the information that we see going out from the individual ministries. Everything should be designed to encourage people to get more training and to help them if they don't understand something. There should be numbers always prepared so that if people can't read the material, they know where to call. It's a fact, Mr. Speaker, that people with literacy deficits, I guess, people who are illiterate are often very sensitive about that. I mean, it can affect their workplace, it can affect their lives, and they often will hide it very well, Mr. Speaker. They're certainly very good listeners. They want to hear something rather than read it. I've heard of teachers that are talking to parents during parent-teacher interviews, and in fact, my sister-in-law is a teacher, Mr. Speaker, and she had said that particularly in one community where she worked and there was a high level of literacy issues there, she said that often when she would tell the parents, well, I've written that in the report, the parents would push the report aside and say, no, you tell me. I've come to this interview. I want you to tell me. And that's their way of covering up that they really couldn't read the report, but they cared about their children and they were at the interview and they wanted to be told. So, but they wouldn't say to the teacher, I'm sorry, I can't read that, because there's an element of embarrassment and maybe even shame that they have not been able to read. So we need to reach out and actually do more on that. I noticed the Minister of Education had sent a package of posters to the MLA offices. I don't know if the other members of the House had received those packages, but they showed different people I think they were trying to reflect Nova Scotians, the breadth of Nova Scotians. They showed a father and a son the line was that they were learning together. They were both learning. And so it's showing you adults that are trying to get those basic skills. And the Minister of Education had sent a note saying, we're trying to get the word out. We want the word out that there are free programs available for adults to come back and learn, and that this is something that you can do. And I know that each year there is a wonderful sort of graduation ceremony held, and I was the education critic at one time and did attend that. And it is a fantastic day to hear some of the inspiring stories of adults who have lived with the inability to read and write fully and have gone back to school and have done that. And they are so proud, and each and every one of them have a different story, but they are so proud, and their children are proud of them, and they now feel they can sit down and help their children with literacy issues. And Mr. Speaker, that really is what we need to be striving for, so that we take the 40% of Nova Scotians who can't operate fully in our economy and help give them the skills so that they can earn more money, fill the jobs that are out there for higher skilled people, and be able to actually raise their standard of living while they help our province. One of our biggest issues is a shortage of people. So we know that the demographics show a declining population. And I'm sure the members will remember, and I think it's worth noting when you talk about demographics, that the year 2006 was actually a watershed year for Nova Scotia, because that was the year that we had more deaths than we had births. It was the first time in our history of Nova Scotia that the trend had reversed, and that means we're a shrinking population. That's really what it boils down to. And we know we talk about immigration as a good avenue to bring more people here, and certainly it is. And there's been nobody that's more excited by the idea of us being a welcoming society and bringing people here from around the world. But we also have 40% of our own population that couldn't begin to read this act, an act respecting Nova Scotia land surveyors. That to me is just a sad state of affairs. And we've also heard lately that our productivity is low in Nova Scotia. And there's a couple of factors for that. Now, I don't think it's holidays that causes that either. I will say that very loudly. I don't think we have enough provincial holidays or statutory holidays. Have you ever heard that attached to productivity? People suggest that's a productivity problem, but yes. Anyway, all I'm saying is there are some really big factors that affect that, and it isn't because we are lazy. It isn't because we get an ample amount of days off in the year. In fact, Nova Scotians work hard and don't even take the holidays that we are given. From a health perspective, we know you should take the amount of holidays that you're given, because then you are recharged, healthier, balanced. That would be nice, yes, exactly. But we do need more holidays, that's one thing, only because we don't have balance worked into our life. But that's not the cause that productivity would suffer from. Mr. Speaker, productivity suffers because we have a high rate of illiteracy. And so we have people on the job that can't work to their full potential. And I believe the government should be looking at tax credits or programs that individual employers could tap into that would encourage them to set up literacy programs on site. And I read a very interesting article recently, Mr. Speaker, about literacy on the job, and it actually equated a lot more injuries and accidents on the job to our rate of illiteracy. And it would be interesting to note if there was some way we could look at that in Nova Scotia, but this was a national study that said that if you have accidents on the job, you should actually investigate with that lens about how literacy may have impacted the accident occurring. I mean, if you mix chemicals that you shouldn't mix together, perhaps because you couldn't read the instructions, or you operate machinery incorrectly because you couldn't read those instructions, it comes back again to people being vulnerable for that reason. And so, I just strongly believe, Mr. Speaker, that we need to put a focus on literacy and helping every single Nova Scotian be able to meet their full potential, because there is no segment of the population population that we can leave behind as we go forward in our province. If we want to advance and grow the economy, as we hear the government say, getting back to balance is the common expression being used, but it's about making every Nova Scotian able to contribute to their highest ability. And one way we can help right now is starting to address that literacy rate, which we know is bad. And I know we're at the Canadian average on that, but by the same token, we can do better. I mean, Nova Scotia is an education province, and I think that phrase we need to repeat and to celebrate. We have great universities. We have 13 campuses for the Nova Scotia Community College. We have, other schools, private institutions here as well. But for a little province, for less than 1 million people, we have a lot of higher education, a lot of opportunities for education. And one of our members mentioned recently, I believe it was the member from Kings West, that actually the level of dropouts from school is declining. And that's something we can be proud of too. It was mentioned to the Minister of Education that the cost is going to go up for our education system because some of the kids that we're keeping in school need more support. They can learn and they will learn, but they need more support. And it's worthwhile for us to spend the money now and help them graduate so that they can take their place throughout society, so that they can become land surveyors if that's what they really want to do. I mean, that's our aim right now, to see them do their best that they possibly can. There. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, there's a lot in this bill on land surveying, and I think that one point that's been raised by a number of speakers has been the Code of Ethics. And I was able to find that reference. It's quite near the back of the Act. There is a reference that speaks about having the standards of practice and the Code of Ethics applicable to this Act. And it also says that there was a previous Code of Ethics. I had asked the minister, but on that, it's page 23, it did actually say that the former Code of Ethics would remain in place until this Act comes into play. So it may be that the former Code of Ethics that they've been operating under for many years has met the mark, and I'm not sure if it's going to be updated or not. But the point raised by a number of the other speakers, Mr. Speaker, welcome to the chair. And the point raised by many of the other speakers was that there is a Code of Ethics for land surveyors. We know that there's a Code of Ethics for many other professions. I believe there's a Code of Ethics at City Hall here in HRM. They've looked at a Code of Ethics for their councillors, but we don't have a Code of Ethics for ourselves. And
we have one in the whale lodge.
There's one in this Act. There is a Code of Ethics in this Act. Yes, exactly. And our point really is that the land surveyors know that they need a Code of Ethics, and that all kinds of other professions recognize the need to really write down what standard we're going to hold ourselves to in the conduct of our day-to-day business. And I'm sure that we could write a very good Code of Ethics for this House. And I would suggest that if the women were involved, we might include some codes around conduct and probably decorum. Decorum might be a big part of it. There might even be a few other members that would join in that observation that we could do better. I must say the decorum is very good in the House today, Mr. Speaker. It is very good. People are attentive. That's no yelling. I much prefer this to question period, but anyway, question period has its purpose as well. It's just that at this point we can talk in more depth, and I certainly do like to talk in some more depth, as the member from Digby knows. We like to get into lots of discussions on the detail of the bills before us. So we were looking at the Land Surveyors Act, and in considering property and land, it's hard not to look at the kind of experience that I've had over the last 10 years as an elected representative, because the area that I represent is very new. Much of it is very newly developed in that 10-year period. And in fact, 20 years ago, I moved to Clayton Park West, which was at that time a community on paper only, really. It had 2 streets, really, that were open. A road that still had barricades across it for the next street that would be put in, and it was all forest. And today when you go there, there are about 10,000 people that live in Clayton Park West. It includes the large corridor of Parkland Drive, Mr. Speaker, and that corridor has more people living with an address on Parkland Drive than I would suggest are in many towns in Nova Scotia. It absolutely is. It's more than a village. It's the size of a town. It really is. And we have all multi-unit buildings along that street. And again, I know the member from Digby knows it because you have a son that lives in that area. And the apartments are new, they're well kept, and they are one after the other along that corridor. And that was designed on purpose, Mr. Speaker. I don't want people to think that that was just something that happened by chance. The density of Clayton Park West was laid out before I ever bought my home in 1990. It was determined on paper by the developer when they went for their first approvals. And of course, a lot of the land there was purchased from the Sisters of Charity, who at one time owned a whole swath of land that went from the Bedford Basin, including Mount St. Vincent University, and came right up the hill through Sheffield, across Dunbrack, through Clayton Park West, all the way into the Blue Mountain Birch Cove Lakes area, which includes Susie's Lake. And the Sisters of Charity still own about 150 acres on the shores of Susie's Lake and right behind Kent Building Supplies, which is the last parcel of their land, really, that they are holding from their founding in I think it was 1849. And so that is very near and dear to their heart, their final parcel of land, because over the years, you know, generations of the Sisters of Charity would go there, would enjoy nature in that area and walk through the woods to get there. Now those areas of woods are all my community, and as I said, they're home to, you know, tens of thousands of people right now. And so we've seen that area spring up really in a 20-year period. And if you go back another 25 years, you'll see that Clayton Park itself, the original Clayton Park, when it was first founded, was again all woods and became a beautiful community with mature trees and a wonderful sense of community. And it comes from about the early 1960s, the earliest residents in that area. So you can see that in all of the Clayton Park riding, there's very little that is older, that has a historic basis. A little bit in Old Rockingham along the Bedford Highway, that area, that connector to Bedford and on to Windsor, was there from the earliest time of the city of Halifax. But in fact, many will know the Princess Lodge along the Bedford Highway. It doesn't fall in my area now, but it did when I was a city councillor. That's the little round house that's along the Bedford Highway. And it is from the early 1800s and signals the area that was a country estate, actually, of one of the governors of Halifax, the same governor who built Government House and the round clock at the top of or bottom of Citadel Hill, but the top of the street, and also the round church, St. George's Church, which is in the North End. That's right. And it's a beautiful church that we are so happy was rebuilt, because it burnt down in the 1990s. There was a fire in the church, and it was a tremendous thing that because of its historic value and because of its importance to the community, and not only the community of Anglicans who worship there, but to the wider community, that church was rebuilt with help, I know, from many levels of government, and certainly Heritage Canada helped, I know that. But you know, they did all kinds of fundraisers to get the money. But as I say, that governor, who I believe was the father of Queen Victoria as well, had a big role to play here in Halifax. In fact, I know he was the father of Queen Victoria. I shouldn't say I'm thinking about it. I just can't remember his exact name. George, maybe. But I think it was George. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, my area has that little bit of connection to the history, and it's a very colorful and royal history of Halifax, but it had very little that was historic. Most of our lands are newly developed and of course relied very much on the surveyors that helped us to do that work. There was an awful lot of surveying, and again, we understand how important that is, the importance of making sure it's done right, that there are no property disputes. I know many people who would be representing older communities probably do see that, where the lines of ownership are unclear, where a single parcel of land might have had several bits that are put together. I actually ran into that problem, Mr. Speaker, at a family cottage that we owned in Queens County, that when we looked at it, it had 5 different pieces of description, because there had been a provincial road that had gone through it, which was now just a driveway to the cottage. So there was a little piece that had been sort of purchased for $1 from the Department of Transportation, you know, 50 or 60 years ago, and different little pieces that came together on a property that was less than an acre. And so we had a boundary dispute with our neighbor at that cottage, who actually encroached and used what he thought was the public road, which in fact was not the public road and had not been for 60 years. It was our own property, and had come down the public road and had used it and tried to encroach at the same time upon our property. And Mr. Speaker, that led to a dispute. We had to find the property records. We had to get a lawyer to look at what exactly that we owned, and we had to assert our rights as property owners. And it is left to the individual to do that. You can't complain to your municipality.
You have to resurvey.
I believe it was resurveyed. Yes, it was, and that is a big cost as well. I'll tell you that. If you have any encroachment on an old property or a new one, but it's more apt to happen in an old one, because with new properties that I was describing in Clayton Park West, there's really no question about those lines. The lines of ownership are very clear, and they're well registered, and you're not going to run into that kind of difficulty. It's the old properties that have been around for a long time and haven't been sold, so they've never been consolidated. Those kind of issues come up. And actually, in that dispute that we had, it did have to be resurveyed. I think maybe the neighbor paid for the survey. I think that was the case. But it's also been migrated, which takes us to the issue of the new property management that we've got, which came into place in the last, 8 years, perhaps? I think it was just about the time I arrived at the legislature, around 2003, that we began to set up a digital record of all the properties in the province. And I think that will ultimately be a tremendous advantage. I think about half the properties have already been what they call migrated, which means they are now into the system that's digital. And to get there, that property has to either be refinanced or sold if there's an exchange of property. In fact, I had to refinance my property this year for a special reason, and for that reason I had to migrate my property, which I wasn't too happy about, because there's about a $1,000 charge to do that. And anybody who's faced with it is told it's a one-time charge. So you just pay the once. No other property owner, when they buy my home or I sell it, will ever have to incur that cost. And that is going to be a bit painful for people, as each and every property over time does get brought back into this electronic system. But it's been a tremendous advantage for lawyers and people doing work with property, because now they don't have to go into the archives and the vaults essentially and pore over the old records of properties. You know, some of those are wonderful historical documents. I mentioned the property ownership of the Sisters of Charity, which was that long strip coming up from the water at the Bedford Basin. And when we look at those old records, they're really interesting. They are all long, narrow strips, because the important part to landowners in the early days of Halifax, and probably even today, is water frontage. People wanted a place to moor. They had boats. They traveled a lot from the city to Birch Cove and Rockingham by boats, and they wanted to have that access to the water frontage. And so the properties were divvied up in long strips, starting with water frontage and then going straight back, way back into the woods, essentially. And so that still remains on those old records, and they're wonderful to see. But those records need to be maintained and kept as historical documents, and it's pretty difficult for the lawyers to be combing over, basically a couple of centuries of land records. So having the current records on a database is a great help. I think it's led to a lot of efficiencies, and it certainly helps whether you're buying or selling property. It can expedite things a little bit, and also give you a more, probably a greater certainty about your ownership, because I go back to the dispute that we had at the cottage, where in fact we were disputing where the boundary was and the lines, and that was an old piece of property in Queens County that had just not been consolidated and never resurveyed for a long time. So we need to get those records up to date, Mr. Speaker, and who do we depend upon to do that? Land surveyors. We need the surveyors, and we need their science, their means of maintaining records and so on. So I'm very pleased to say that that dispute was resolved, and again, a legal agreement drawn up so that two neighbours can coexist with reasonable calm. And that's what it's about. It's about trying to ascertain where your ownership is, because people are very territorial. And I can tell you, whether you're on a little lot in the city or a big country lot, people are territorial, and we care about what's ours and where we have our rights. And we hear about that frequently here, because we talked about ATVs a few years ago, the all-terrain vehicles, and particularly in our country areas. I know the minister is well aware of this from Hants County, that there's a lot of trespassing with all-terrain vehicles. People feel there are trails and fields and farmland even that they're allowed to trespass across on these vehicles. And the farmers take exception, and people living in those rural areas may take exception to both the damage to their land and the noise and disruption to their animals or the wildlife that they like to have near their home. I mean, there's a certain beauty in the rural areas, certainly, and people love the fact that there is both wilderness and wild animals sharing that land with them. And ATVs don't respect that and do frighten animals and cause a lot of disruption for people who are doing passive things in the wilderness, like walking, cross-country skiing, things like that. You don't necessarily want to share the land with ATVs. Well, it's easier for me to say because I am in the city riding where it is not a common practice. But I just feel that the ecological impacts are great. But what I saw in that argument was the fact that people want respect for their own land that they own, and how it's managed and how it's respected by others. So we have a certain territorial aspect about that, and often it can lead to great disputes among neighbours. So given that, we have a lot of rules in place, and it's interesting though that the municipalities won't step in. It's all legal. If you want to assert your rights, then you've got to go to a lawyer. And I know a lot of people are reluctant to do that. I said earlier it might have been good to be a lawyer. I was thinking more of the skills here. But I mean, I wonder if it isn't good to be able to understand your rights and be able to represent yourself in those kind of disputes. Because I don't know how often it comes up for others, but I quite often have people with a legal concern, but they're really, quite frankly, frightened to see a lawyer because of the cost. And they know that they probably have a case, but they don't have $5,000 or maybe even more to get the case rolling, or to feel that they can bring it to a point where they will get restitution. So we have to be careful of that, because something like our legal aid system doesn't help for an awful lot of the issues that people come up against. But as I said, Mr. Speaker, the history around land surveying is very clear, that it is really about dispute resolution. It's about getting value for your money. When you purchase something, you know exactly what it is you've purchased. And we do need that kind of assurance. And it became very clear to me, again, just, in any time I've done property transactions, how very careful the banks are, too, about the kind of documentation they require to be absolutely sure that when they're giving you a mortgage, that you have got ownership, and that they have, in turn, they have the right to get their share back. If they've lent you the money, they can repossess or get their value back if you forfeit on your payments. So you can see very clearly how cautious they are. So for that reason, I think that we have a lot to learn from the Act, from Bill 124, because it is about protecting the public. And as I said, encroachment is a real problem, and I don't know that this Act will cover anything about how they set fees for themselves. But as much as I said lawyers are expensive, I wonder if many of us haven't run into the fact that surveyors are very expensive too. And sometimes in relation to the value of the property, it can be really, really out of whack. And I think that we need to ensure that there is some correspondence almost between the value of the property and the work that's being done, because there was certainly an issue that my mother had a problem with in Parsborough, where she actually brought in a complaint against the land surveyor because she felt the cost was so high relative to the work that was done, and the value of the property was about $25,000. So it was a small little property in the town, and the cost to survey it was, you know, something like 10% of the value of the property, which she thought was completely ludicrous. And she did bring that complaint, and I will say at that time she didn't get very much satisfaction from laying a complaint with the Surveyors Association or professional body that manages it. So I hope they're doing a better job under the current Act. And I know there's a whole part in here on hearings that you can actually, I think, bring a complaint. And I think if you're not happy with the resolution of that, they have a process for a hearing board where you can go before them and give a further explanation of what your problem is, I believe. So I think that's important, because whatever act we pass here that's going to govern the work that they are doing, we need to ensure that they are going to listen to the complaints, keep a record of complaints, know whether or not they need to in any way discipline their members, because there is not one profession that you can name that doesn't at least occasionally have to use their powers and discipline their members. And as much as people attain a high level of professionalism, as much as they're proud of the work they're doing in the society they belong to, there's always some bad apples, let's say, in that profession, and you have to be able to ensure that the public's protected. So that's why it is absolutely essential that they have a code of conduct, which, as we've said, we don't have here. And there's a wonderful opportunity before the government to be the first government in Nova Scotia to set that code of ethics, to take the high ground, to feel that, you know, you've made a difference in how all subsequent generations of MLAs will actually behave when they get here to the legislature. You know, each and every one of us would sign that, would agree to these high standards that previous MLAs have set for us, and we'd be able to go forward with that knowledge that not only is it an honor and a privilege to be here, but that we accept a big responsibility for a high standard of conduct. And that would be something I think we'd all be proud of, and I'd be proud to put my name to a code of conduct and a code of ethics like that. And as again, to me, this would be just an obvious one that for the government to grab hold of. It's been a Liberal suggestion, that's true. We did suggest it in the wake of well, we've actually suggested over a number of years, but we did suggest it this year as well in the wake of so much discussion and reform, frankly, so much reform here in the legislature around MLAs and the conduct of our business. What better time to grab hold of that and take the time as an all-party committee to work out what we would see as the high standards that we would want to go forward with. And as I say, it's the Liberals that had introduced that idea. We know that other ideas we introduced in the last year have been taken up, some that are popular, some that are not by the government, but we have certainly introduced reform in the way that we manage our affairs. I can't think of one that would have more meaning to the people of Nova Scotia than to be able to look and see the code of conduct that we have all signed on to and all agreed to as we go forward, because we all recognize the tremendous privilege that we have to sit here and represent thousands of Nova Scotians. And I think that's why we should take it very seriously and try and be part of a solution that would give people of Nova Scotia, the people that we represent, that confidence, because they know that the members of the legislature are good people, and I can say that the members of all parties that I've worked with here on committees and over the years, that people are here for the right reasons, that we have all put our name on a ballot and come forward with the intent to make Nova Scotia better in whatever way we can do it. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that is one of the things that this Bill 124 actually encourages us to do. It is a way that we can say, look what we require of the land surveyors. It's not just a nice thing to have. We require them to have a code of conduct and code of ethics. So why wouldn't we do the same for ourselves? And I see that the Leader of the official opposition is in full agreement with that, and that's important to me too. So as we look at this bill, I mentioned to you the tremendous challenges in a new area like mine, where it isn't about property ownership or encroachment. It's about how you map out what is really a forest and create a a home for 20,000 people. And that has happened so quickly in Clayton Park, Mr. Speaker. It's actually occurred in a short 20 years that we have a whole new community there. And not just a community of houses, it's not just a suburb. I think we have to make sure, and we've got a suburban committee now that I think would maybe at some point want to talk to me, because I think that there's so much we can do about creating suburbs. It's almost, a suburb is almost a bad word, and because they're seen as bedroom communities. And bedroom community means that it's a place where you just go home and sleep at night, and then you travel into the city and do your work, and you shop and go to restaurants, and then go home to your bedroom community. And it doesn't really give you the sense that a suburb is you know, maybe it's something that's grown and is adjacent to an original city, but we have all of the facilities there to be a full and complete community. I mean, it takes a little time when you're a new area like Clayton Park West, because, you know, suddenly you're in the midst of blasting, and they're clear cutting, and they're taking away the lumber, and anybody who's lived there has been through the blasting and the dirt and the construction vehicles that are coming and going. So it's a time of great disruption, and it's not very pretty when it's under construction. But once that period's over and people buy those homes and move into the apartment buildings that are being built, it becomes a community. And I've always felt that my main job as a representative for that area, both as a city councillor and since I've been an MLA, has been to fight for the facilities that we need that bring us together as a community, so that we don't have to travel out by car for everything we need to do, that we have the facilities that bring us together, and that we have, and that includes schools. It includes the library that we had open in 2002. It includes our new Big Canada Games Centre, which has been on our agenda for 10 years in that area, to get a decent, large-scale recreation centre that could replace the little pool we've had. Northcliffe Pool has been our area so-called community centre, but there's not much there. It's just a pool. It isn't a place where community comes together and stays or has a cup of coffee or meets, or there were no meeting rooms or ways to have clubs. It had very limited use, but I mean, certainly a great place for the kids to take their swimming lessons or to go for water aerobics, but not a lot of other activities that you could do in the Northcliffe Pool Centre, because it just wasn't big enough and it wasn't built with that in mind. And it was actually built in the 1970s when there was very few people living in our area. It was built when the original part of Clayton Park was only about 10 or 15 years old. There were a few homes in the upper part of Rockingham that were new. Dunbrack Street didn't exist. It wasn't even mapped out yet. So it started as an outdoor pool, and that was great for the community for a while, and then the community thought that they'd like to use it year-round, so a bubble was put over it for a number of years, so it was just an inflatable bubble. That broke after a while, and there was a fundraising effort in the community, along with the YMCA at the time, and a structure was built around that old outdoor pool. Well, it was never right for the community. It wasn't properly built, really. It was an outdoor pool that they just covered. And so the air exchanging and other things were a problem in that building, and it has had a lot of structural problems, and the roof is very bad. It was it just wasn't good. There was too much moisture. So what we're about to see now is another major piece of community infrastructure coming in the area of the Mainland Common, which is, as people will know, about 175 acres. It's bigger than the Point Pleasant Park lands. I think that's 100 acres in Point Pleasant Park. The Mainland Common was something that we really should tip our hat to the City of Halifax before amalgamation. They saw that the only growth area for them was onto the mainland, into Spryfield and into the area around Fairview. Shall we tip our hats to them too? Okay. Well, having a new centre, we certainly are delighted with the provincial government's involvement in that new centre. Yes, I'm talking more of the history of it, but it began with actually having the city have enough foresight to put aside 175 acres. That, again, we go back to the idea of land surveying. The fact was that was all back in the woods, and there was nothing close to it at that time. But they realized that on paper they had all of these areas that would be developed, and they had the plans for a very extensive community in Clayton Park West and Sheffield and Cresthaven, all of these in that area. Right now we have another whole new area which is just adjacent to the Fairview riding, but it's still in Clayton Park. It's the Mount Royal subdivision, which again was all woods right by the 102 highway in Dunbrack, and that whole area has been cleared, streets are down and new homes are going in. So as that was happening, they realized they were going to have a lot of people. Is there an introduction? Did you want to do an introduction? I see we have guests in the gallery, and I've been asked to allow time for an introduction. I'd be happy to.
Well, I would thank the honourable member for that courtesy. I will now introduce the honourable Minister for Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I also thank the honourable member for taking from her time. I would like to welcome some young women from the Techsploration program. The Techsploration program introduces grade 9 young women to careers in sciences, trades, and technology. And they have arrived here from speaking at the 13th annual launch of Techsploration. The students represent schools from all across the province. So we welcome you to our legislature here today, and I ask our colleagues to give them the warm welcome of the House.
We welcome all guests to the legislature and hope you enjoy the proceedings as we are on bills for second reading, the 124, the Land Surveyors Act. I will now introduce the honourable member for Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm actually thrilled that the young women are here from Techsploration because they had an event today that I hope to get to that was at the Seaport. And I know that that was on today, and I had said that I would try and get there, but unfortunately our House is sitting longer today, and there were some pressing needs. I needed to be here to talk on the Land Surveyors Act, and I hope to give all members of the House a better sense of the new communities that are in our city as well, about the different kind of history that we each share. But Techsploration is a terrific program, and it actually teaches women, and I'm glad actually they're up there because this reminds me of something very important in my last 10 minutes. It actually, I may change direction for this, but for Techsploration, as some of you may know, it's a program where they go into the junior highs and match these young women with women who work in technical and scientific professions. So it allows women to look at some of the careers, or young women, to look at some of the careers that they may not have thought of, that are non-traditional for women. And they get a chance to meet a woman who's actually doing that. I know they go to things like the Bedford Institute of Oceanography. They go to some of the factories and actually see some of the trades. They do scientific things. I'm sure you go to the universities as well and see some of the women working in universities, in labs, and so on. And I think it's a really important thing. And I know that at least a few years ago, there were students from Fairview Junior High that were introduced into that program. I don't know if we have anybody here today from Fairview, but I hope we do. And I know that was a program brought to Fairview Junior High as well in its early days. And not only do the young women learn, but there's also a time when they can bring back that knowledge to the school and share it with all the students, so that if only a number have been able to go out on these placements, they come back, share their experience, and some of the mentors come back with them and get to speak to the wider student body, including the boys, who again can learn from that experience. So I think it does an awful lot of good, and those are the kind of programs. There's another reason, Mr. Speaker, it's very good fortune that we have Techsploration with us, and that is that I began my hour in the House here today speaking on this bill. I began by talking about literacy and how important it is that we be literate and have a good education, because without that we have so many Nova Scotians who can't meet their full potential. And I think when young people have the chance to go out and meet somebody that they can identify with in a job or profession, it gives them the encouragement and maybe even gives them a dream that they didn't have before, that this is something I can do with my skills. I'd be able to do that job too, and it gives them something to work towards, to stay in school and to succeed. And as I said in my opening comments, it's so important that we not allow any of our young people to fall by the wayside wayside because we are a province which doesn't have a lot of people. For our size, we are declining. Less than 1 million people in this province that we love, and we need to make sure that everyone who calls Nova Scotia home can find work and find a way to contribute as much as possible with their skills, and so really reach their highest potential. And at the same time, while we're speaking here, and really the content of this bill is a bill that outlines the practice of being a land surveyor, how they will be managed, how that profession maintains high standards. And while we're talking about that, Mr. Speaker, I think it is important that we talk a little bit about the Nova Scotia Community College. And I hear that I have only 5 minutes left. So I think that's a great time to mention the geomatics school at the Nova Scotia Community College in Lawrencetown. And that's one of the campuses of I mentioned there were 13 campuses across our province, and really allowing young people to access education close to home, which is important too because of the cost of any college or university education. But Lawrencetown is very unique in that it has a college that was originally a survey school and has branched so much beyond that. Surveying is certainly part of it because they are doing map making, they're doing GIS, which is global positioning studies, and they really are a school where employers come from around the world and hire those graduates. They're working in the petroleum industry, mapping the offshore, not just here in Nova Scotia, where our offshore is really very, very small in the scheme of things, but they're in the Gulf of Mexico, they're in the North Sea, they're working for companies that are doing things like undersea mapping and of course land mapping as well. And so, you know, GIS and the power of that technology is something that we've been pioneering right here in Nova Scotia. And you know, occasionally you'll see ads on TV for NSCC that show map makers, but it really begins, the basis of that, if you're going to be a cartographer and you're going to be involved in map making, the basis of it is being able to identify properties and have a proper record of the exact property lines and how somebody could exactly pinpoint the ownership of land. And I've given a few reasons today why that's so important. It's to prevent conflict between neighbors. It's to allow you to be able to mortgage and finance properties, because that's not going to happen if you can't ascertain that you've got full ownership of it. And it protects people financially. So, you know, ultimately that proof of ownership is your protection financially. So the work that land surveyors do is very, very important. And, you know, I'd like to mention as well, or just go back again to the fact that we have a long history of mapping and surveying in this province. I mean, the very first maps almost of North America are from what is his name? Samuel Champlain, who mapped the South Shore. He mapped Port Mattoon and the area around that bay, and also right into the Bay of Fundy and all the way up to Isle Haute, I think, which I know that the Isle Haute, that's how we say it. We don't say it with a very good French accent. It's been anglicized. But anyway, it's near Advocate. It is up in Cumberland County near Advocate, and it is a landmark for fishermen. And I know that the member from Digby had visited there not very long ago during the by-election in Cumberland County. So, but those original place names, even Port Mattoon, which is named, I suppose if we said it with a proper accent, Mouton, it was named after a sheep that was thrown overboard. But Samuel Champlain was a tremendous cartographer, and he did map the shoreline of the Bay of Fundy and the South Shore, and ultimately not long after founded Port Royal, which is our first European settlement in North America. And so we have that as a starting point. We have the founding of Halifax in 1749, Mr. Speaker, where the streets and the grid that Halifax is built on were laid out around Citadel, which our Citadel Hill, because as I said in the beginning, Halifax was founded as a fortification, really, to be a counterbalance to Louisbourg in Cape Breton. At that time, Cape Breton was still part of the French colonies and not part of British North America. So we needed that at the time, and so we had a city built out directly below the Citadel. I believe I have only 1 minute left in my time, and I have enjoyed it very much. I hope that we've all learned lots. I've talked about land surveyors so much about land surveyors. Bill 124 will set out the practice of land surveying. We know that it is a proud profession. We expect that through the passing of this bill that it will again ensure that they manage themselves well, hold themselves to a high code of conduct. And again, I say there is a message for us in the legislature that we could also mimic their high standards by setting a code of conduct for ourselves. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I will now recognize the honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the honourable member for Halifax-Clayton Park for being so succinct today with her comments. And I learned, I was interested to hear about Port Mattoon and how it was named, and after a sheep thrown overboard. And the member, the member from Pictou East has asked me to do an hour in Gaelic, and Mr. Speaker, I would love to have that ability, and maybe someday I'll be able to. Unfortunately, some of my Gaelic, I'd love to do 5 minutes. Hami and Dachas un law be me a Brian a shin coig minichin. Hanyel me a Gina Ganju. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll return to English for a moment. And it's nice to hear the. It's everything sounds better in Gaelic, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the members for sharing their applause and some Gaelic words being spoken in the House. It's a very old language, and it's nice to try to keep it going in our province. Yes. And I know that a lot of our seniors and our elderly, their faces light up when you're able to share a few words with them in Gaelic. It reminds them of the old days and when the language was more prominent, and of course that ties in right to our bloodlines and our family histories, and those are all good things, Mr. Speaker. But now to the matter at hand, because I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, I want to focus my thoughts on this bill today, and Bill 124, the Land Surveyors Act. And I do want to build upon my colleague from Cape Breton North's comments. He was speaking about the value of a code of ethics in this legislation for surveyors, but the lack of such a code of ethics for the chamber here. And there was one thing that my colleagues and I would like to table, and this is something, perhaps a case in point. We have Wilson Executive Search is looking for a chair for a new board, a new Labour Relations Board, before the legislature here has even approved or passed that legislation to enact a Labour Relations Board. So the question I would ask, Mr. Speaker, for the benefit of all members of this House, is it ethical to be searching for a board chair when this legislation to enact that position has not yet been passed in this legislature? So, and this, of course, Mr. Speaker, is Bill 100, but I want to focus on Bill 124, of course. And I know that this is a good bill, Mr. Speaker, and I know the industry is very supportive, and they've led the charge on this. And I know that the changes will include public representation on the association's council and streamlining the public complaints and discipline process. And there have been no major revisions to this act since 1989, but over the last 20 years, changes have occurred, as they do in every industry, and I think it's important that the legislation be updated and be modernized, and that's what we're seeing with this act. And some people out there who may be watching today might be wondering, well, what do surveyors do, and how would this legislation impact Nova Scotians? And my colleague here said it would be helpful to learn more about that. And, you know, when do we need to have a survey done? Well, we might need to know the location of boundaries of our property. We might intend to subdivide a property or lease out some land. And a survey is required, Mr. Speaker, to ensure all is in order. Whenever you intend to buy or invest in a property or build on any property, you need to have a survey. And this legislation is going to help consumers, Mr. Speaker. Whenever you're concerned about encroachments on your own property, you may need to get a survey to clarify those matters. And this bill will help the industry to deliver a good service to the public and safeguard the consumer. Now, surveyors, some of the things that they would do, they might do a lot survey to determine the boundaries on a parcel of land. That we often see these markers in the corners of a property. I remember we had a property in Judic surveyed one time, and we saw some stakes go into the ground on the corners of the property, and they're still there today, and you can find them. And these are important, Mr. Speaker. They help with future surveying. And I have some friends who've gone to school and who've become surveyors, and I know they're supportive of this legislation. Some of the other things that a surveyor might do would be a subdivision survey. So whenever there's new lots being created or changes in the boundaries of existing lots, the Nova Scotia Land Surveyor can assist people with the steps leading to final municipal approval and registration of the subdivision. We might also need a surveyor to do a retracement survey. This would reestablish original boundary lines and replaces corner markers that we've just spoken about that may have been lost or obscured by forest or construction activities or other erosion perhaps. And surveyors provide all kinds of other services, which may include topographic or hydrographic surveys on land or water, precise construction layout and as-built surveys, accident surveys, condominium surveys that we might see more so here in the urban area of the province in Halifax. Could be accident surveys, as I think I've just mentioned, legal descriptions, acquiring and compiling spatial information for geographic information systems, and application of global positioning technology. And so, Mr. Speaker, there's costs for these services. But back to this bill, this is really focusing, and costs are important because consumers are paying those costs. And what this bill helps to do is provide a framework for the industry to be able to operate ethically and give consumers good value for their dollar when they need to get these kinds of this kind of work done. So, you know, some of the things that might be called into question will be assisted with this bill, with this legislation. That might be when the surveyors are consulting with the client throughout the project. There's time spent on that. If that's called into question, this legislation will help. If there's time spent searching for deeds, plans, or other documents, might be from government or from other private sources that information is coming from. Time spent at the site of the survey, consulting with other professionals when necessary, analyzing and assessing field survey and documentary evidence, performing computations and preparing survey plans and reports, and preparing and submitting applications on behalf of the client. The goal, of course, Mr. Speaker, with all of this is for people so they can know the exact location of their property boundaries and provide peace of mind and enable landowners to carry out projects without fear of costly legal procedures. And it saves a lot of headaches, Mr. Speaker, and this legislation is going to help ensure that those kinds of activities can happen with fewer headaches. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill, and I can say this about a lot of industries in our province and right across North America, the ability to self-regulate has great value, and it can work very well to protect the integrity of an industry and to give confidence to consumers. And I do know that industries respect this privilege because they've been given the value to hold the privilege to self-regulate and to have freedom to self-regulate. And I know from working in the financial industry that industries will work hard to protect their consumers and to ensure people are satisfied and happy about their experience. And I know there are times when that does not happen. And that is, people might say, well, you know, why would industries be working hard to protect their consumers? They might be cynical about that. We've seen that in the financial industry over the past number of years when we had the decline in the stock market and the housing bubble in the U.S. And some would make a point, and it would be a very good point, that you know, maybe sometimes industry doesn't do a good job of policing itself. And I think that is a point well made, Mr. Speaker. However, there are still benefits to self-regulation, and perhaps if there's something wrong which has caused the housing bubble or caused the stock market to decline, perhaps it's not just self-regulation that's caused that. Perhaps it's maybe the policing of the self-regulation that's caused that. So, and I know if governments felt that self-regulation was a real contributor to this in its sense of being self-regulation, then governments and the public would be calling for the elimination of this form of regulation, and they're not doing that because I think, Mr. Speaker, people believe that industries do care about their consumers. They want to protect their consumers because, as we know in business, Mr. Speaker, there's nothing better than a return customer. And if you're going to have return customers, whether it's in any industry, including the surveying industry, you want people to be happy about their experience when they're. So if people are dealing with a surveyor, this legislation is going to help to ensure that people using the services of a surveyor come away with a good experience, they're happy about it, and they're willing to use that service again. And also, we must remember that this service of surveying helps our economy because when a building needs to be constructed, if it's not properly surveyed or there's problems, you can have legal disputes that slow down economic activity. And this bill will help with that, will help to guard against such things happening. So, Mr. Speaker, I would also like to make the point that there are rogues out there and people who would be taking advantage of their position in an industry to benefit themselves selfishly. And I know that industries are very cognizant of that because if you have a rogue who's offering, in this case, perhaps surveying services and is not complicit with the regulations, that's going to cause a bad reputation for the whole industry. And Mr. Speaker, we need to have people confident when they go to purchase goods and services here in our province that the services and the goods they're being provided with are they're being given a fair deal, and that their people are treated fairly. And I know that industries take it very seriously when there are rogues who are not respecting the rules and regulations that the industry is supposed to be operating with. I can compare this, Mr. Speaker, to the financial industry where people who are buying and selling securities require to be licensed, much like surveyors here. And, you know, there are courses that are needed to be taken to be properly educated and trained to have an understanding of the markets. Much the same way surveyors are required to have education and licensing to do the work that they do. And I know that in the financial industry, you have to have knowledge of economics, you have to have the securities course, you have to have a course on ethics. And you look at situations, sometimes with ethics, it's not black and white. You may have a conflict. You may have two values that are working perhaps against each other, and they may be both honorable values. And I think if I could give you one example, Mr. Speaker, I think of truth and mercy. And you may be placed in a situation where it's important to be telling the truth and to uphold a principle. Converse to that, you may have a situation where you may be faced with the value of mercy. And perhaps considering all the intangibles and the tangibles of the situation, and your heart may swing towards the side of mercy. And that's an honorable value as well. So sometimes, like in this bill, which has a code of ethics, people are faced with those decisions and those choices. And this legislation will help people, learn about ethics and how the industry has to deal with situations that may have values that conflict with one another. And it will help surveyors to at least be consistent, perhaps, with their decisions. And it will help the industry form regulations that have some logic and and I know they have all kinds of those already, but it's important to have it formalized in legislation. And I also know, I'm not sure about the surveying industry, but I know in the financial industry that there are compliance officers, and most firms have officers that police the activity. And that's part of self-regulation, Mr. Speaker, because if there's not somebody policing it, you may have a tendency to have people who become lax with regulations. And then you spoil the intent of delivering goods and services, in this case here in our province, in a fair manner. And you may have people who maybe even be by mistake may do things that are inappropriate. And the value of having a compliance officer or a watchdog helps to ensure that people are on the up and up, and that if there is something that appears to be improper, that there's a mechanism to quickly correct that and fix that problem before it becomes a bigger problem. And I know with this legislation, there is that benefit for surveyors. So, Mr. Speaker, I also know that continuous education is required. And I'm sure in the surveying industry that's the case as well, that there are opportunities for surveyors to be able to further their education, their knowledge of the industry. And that's important because as times change and things change, Nova Scotians deserve to be able to have services that are current, and to be able to, and also to ensure that they meet with any changes in future legislation. And I know there's things like refresher courses and courses on rules and procedures. And I do truly believe that these industries, and the surveying industry in this province is no different, I do believe that these industries value not just the letter of the law with this legislation and with codes of ethics, but I do believe that they value the spirit of the law as well. And I will say, Mr. Speaker, I do believe there is a role for government in self-regulating industries. There's a continued role for government to work with an industry that is self-regulating. And if we look at I'm sure everybody in this room, Mr. Speaker, if not through their own personal savings, through our pension plans, have, and any Nova Scotian who has savings or a pension plan or a tax-free savings account or an RRSP, any kind of investment account, you would have been affected by what's happened in the stock market. And we saw what can happen when a self-regulated industry is perhaps not policed to the degree that it should be. And so there is a continued role for government to protect consumers and protect the integrity of and in the case of this bill, of surveying, but if you expand it beyond that, in other things like, say, the financial markets. Because and one example that could relate to surveying, if you have an industry that's not doing things as they say they are, for instance, saying that certain investments are safer than they really are, and hiding bad investments in the mix, and if that's not being watched by a government agency, you get what happened in the United States, which was an inflated housing market, inflated property housing prices, and when there were loans being given out to people with no income and no job or assets, and when they couldn't pay the bill, and they couldn't pay the bank for that loan, things started to crumble. And the tragedy of it all was most people wouldn't want to be investing in low-grade loans, but they were invested in them because there were rating agencies that were stamping these products with a quality rating, which led people to believe that the investments in real estate that were made in those securities were better than they were, that they were stable, they were safe, and of course many people got hurt by that. And we have issues recently with the pension in this province, where the government had to take steps to try to reverse the effects of what had happened in the financial markets. So self-regulation, I believe, Mr. Speaker, is very important, but there is a continued role for government to ensure that even if an industry is self-regulating, that there is a watchdog. There are mechanisms in place to protect if something starts to happen in a self-regulated industry that shouldn't be happening. So I don't know, Mr. Speaker, if anybody has, I'm sure some of the members in here have seen the movie Wall Street, and I know the Wall Street 2 recently came out, and I haven't had a chance to see it, but that's a good example of a self-regulating industry where people are committing illegal acts, and it was an excellent movie. The first 20 minutes of that movie, I believe it was, and perhaps one of the members may correct me, but I believe that was a Stanley Kubrick film. No? I can't, yeah. I believe it was, but I do know the first 20 minutes of that film, for a self-regulated industry, there's a lot of examples there of what's going on, and perhaps rules maybe being broken there, but it really was of great interest to me when I watched it, because and it's probably one area where Nova Scotians, if they wanted to get a look at what a self-regulated industry looks like and some of the aspects, if they had time to sit down to watch that first part of the movie and have somebody with them there to explain some of the things going on, it's a good example of an industry that's self-regulated, and I know I look forward to watching Wall Street 2. So, Mr. Speaker, I will say that this legislation and the first Land Surveyors Association bill that provided self-governing status was passed in this legislature in 1951 by a gentleman from Inverness County, a man by the name of Angus L. MacDonald. And to show the members of this House that I can cross political lines, I do recognize that Angus L. was a member of the Liberal Party. And he's a very famous member of this legislature, very well respected. And we, of course, have the Angus L. MacDonald Bridge named after him. And, of course, the member from Victoria says he travels it all the time, and many of us do coming in the city. And you know, if I could tell a little bit about Angus L., he was born in 1890, which is quite some time ago, and it was in Inverness County and on the family farm at Dunvegan. And he came out of a family of 14 people. And those were the days, Mr. Speaker, when we had large families in this province, and I don't know if we'll see another day when we'll see families to the tune of 14 children. I know it would certainly help with our GDP growth. As we know, population is strongly correlated to GDP growth, but certainly at that time, many children in the family was a big help, because in those days, if you had many hands on the farm, you could, many hands made light work. There were economies of scale, and I know many families at that time in our province had big families. His Angus L.'s wife was from a prominent Acadian family from, excuse me? And Mr. Speaker, just to clarify, were you saying that oh, you had 21 in your family? The Speaker, who was sitting in the chair, the honourable member from Cape Breton Nova, had 21 members in his father's family. That is a huge family, Mr. Speaker, and a credit to him and to her as well for that achievement. Perhaps I'll stop right there. But that is a tremendous, but you think of the sacrifice made by that family, because I'm sure there were days when it might have been hard to make sure that every one of those 21 mouths got fed. But you think of the contribution that's still being felt today by that family. And of course, we have an individual sitting in the speaker's chair, but when you start with 21 people back then and start expanding those families out, think of how many Nova Scotians are contributing to the economy of our province. And how many votes there are too. That's a good point. And and perhaps that's a lesson to us all in this chamber, that we should be using that perhaps as a who needs voter ID when you can have 21 children in your family for future generations of supporters. So, Mr. Speaker, I do know that back to Angus L. He was a Roman Catholic. He was a Catholic, and his family were ardent Liberal Party supporters. And to this day, we see trends in the province where Catholics would be voting Liberal and the Protestants would be voting Tory. I don't know what happened along my lines. Well, I do, but I probably won't get into that today. But I know in Inverness County, there's many, whether it's the Acadians or the Mi'kmaq or many of the Gaelic-speaking peoples that came from Scotland were Catholic, and as a result, we've had many good Liberal members in this House since this House began. But there are times we had some good Tory ones as well, and I thank the member from Victoria for reminding me of that. And it's and I do know that sometimes there are people who switch allegiances and whatnot, but we do know that Angus L. was a very good member in this House. And where did he represent? Well, that's a good question. I believe he represented a seat here in the city at one point in time. Yes, and to move back to my remarks, I'm trying to keep this discussion positive.
Alan, Halifax Ferry is going to be open soon if you need a seat.
So, Mr. Speaker, Angus L., who was the member that introduced legislation around surveying back in 1951, he went to St. X. And I think this is interesting. St. X is, of course, Mr. Speaker, a great university. And this is interesting, though. His family couldn't afford to pay for a university education, so he obtained a teaching license and taught for a couple of years to finance his education. And then midway through his degree, he actually left university again to take another year off to earn spending money and enough money to pay for his tuition and whatnot. And when he completed his degree, he was required to teach at St. X to pay off the remainder. And that would have been back in 1915. And I think we should remember Angus L. as well, Mr. Speaker, for his contribution to during time of war in this country. And in February of 1916, he joined the 185th Battalion, known as the Cape Breton Highlanders, that left for Britain in October of that year. And he received further training there, and he was sent to the front lines in France. And what an experience to have, to later become Premier of the province, to have fought on the front lines during the First World War, a war when perhaps the combatants were much closer in their hand-to-hand combat. There were bayonets at the end of rifles that were probably used quite often. And that was a time, of course, war is a terrible thing, and there's no question that you still see very personal, very close human-to-human contact. But the First World War was particularly devastating because of the technology at that time. Not that I want to be advocating, of course, Mr. Speaker, for better technology in war, but if you look back at the rudimentary weapons and machinery they had, I'm sure he was greatly affected by his time on the front lines. And I know that he did return home in 1919, And a biographer who had written about Angus L. said that war had made him more serious and less self-confident, but struck by the willingness of so many to march to horrible deaths in the name of an abstract principle. I think he was affected by that, as of course anybody would be. And I do know that after war, he went on to Dalhousie Law School and became a lawyer. So this was a very educated man who brought in this original act. Very smart man, came from modest means, financed his way through university, served his country during time of war, studied at Dalhousie, and this is an interesting point, Mr. Speaker. We often talk about the value of our experience and the experience of young people in having a chance to share the experience we have in this chamber, for young people to be able to participate in mock parliaments. And I noticed that Angus L. Led the opposition in a mock parliament at the Dalhousie Law School, and no doubt those are helping to hone some of the skills that he would use on the very floor that we stand on today, Mr. Speaker. And of course that contributed to his compassion and his interest in making the province a better place, and in ultimately creating that bill back in 1951. And
feels that ethics are really important.
but going back to the time of war, I'd like to share a little story with the members of this House. I discovered that I was named after a gentleman who fought in the First World War as well. And it's funny, I never knew this. I knew I was named after a fiddler, a violin player, but I never knew that he was a relative, and I never knew that much about him. But I was contacted by email, this would have been last spring, by a gentleman from England who was writing a book. And the gentleman I was named after was, of course, Alan McMaster, and he grew up in Hillsdale, which is in Judic. And this Alan was during the time of the war. This would have been, of course, before the. He was. I was a little reticent to become involved in this, because the book that was being written was about the Epsom riots, which members of this House, you may or may not be aware, but there was an event that happened after the First World War that put a bit of a dark mark on the history after the war, because there were some Canadian soldiers that were remaining, and soldiers, I think, from some other countries as well, who were still in England at the time, in an area known as Epsom, just south of London. And they were there because some of them were sick. They had injuries. They were not given permission to go back home at this point. And I know that at the time, I'm sure, they were also not looked at. They may have been being looked down upon by some of the local population. I don't know that for sure, Mr. Speaker, but I do know that that there was an incident, and I suppose some of the local women were perhaps catching the eye of some of these soldiers, and who could blame them, Mr. Speaker? Times of war, they're not great times, and you come out of it and you want to get home, and perhaps I should stop at that. But there's no harm in that, Mr. Speaker, and some of the local population were getting upset about perhaps the attention being paid to some of these women, and anyway, what resulted was one of the soldiers was hauled off to the prison. And well, this was just the final straw, because there was quite a bit of tension, and it was coming out at the local pubs and whatnot. And anyway, one of the Canadians was dragged down to the prison, and there was a march by some of the soldiers down to the prison, and they demanded that this colleague of theirs be released. And when that didn't happen, I can't imagine, we don't have any videotape of what happened, of course, back then, but we do know that one of the policemen was killed in that fray, and we don't have proof, conclusive proof, but the gentleman that I'm named after appears to be the man who did it. And of course, when it's a situation like that, you might think it's an accident. Some people might say it's something more than that. But at the end of the day, well, and you know what? I think he was a good man, this Alan McMaster. He saved a man in a mine accident at one point, and that was after this had happened. He had a plate in his head, which no doubt he suffered an injury during the First World War. And I'm proud of him. And going back to, I was a little reticent in getting involved in this because I thought, gee, you know, here's a relative of mine. Do I really want to be confirming that he was the man who perhaps did this? But if nothing else, I think I saved some face for him because I was able to shed some more light on who he was as a person and what had transpired. And you know, I'm proud of him, and I know my father named me after him because my father was only about 5 years old at the time, but he saw him playing the fiddle and he was pretty good at it. And of course, my dad was rubbing sticks together at the age of 3. He wanted to play the fiddle. And so he had a respect for this gentleman, and I look forward to learning more about him. But I thought I would share that with the members of this House because when you find out who you're named after, you take an interest in that person, obviously. And I thought that was an interesting story to weave into my remarks today because I knew that I might need to perhaps expand a little bit beyond the act itself. So,
It's all very relevant. It's all very relevant.
but if I could draw it back, if I could draw it back, you know, Mr. Speaker, our experience in life shape who we are, and they shape our thoughts when we put legislation, much like Angus L. did after having gone through a period of war. And no doubt there were surveyors in the Army as well, building bridges. And I could talk about a man by the name of Denard MacDonald, a great composer who did some work building bridges. But I won't move into that today. I'll save some Denard stories for another day. So Angus L. was the man who brought this legislation into the House. And Mr. Speaker, I know the members will all be interested in this little tidbit that I found. When he was teaching, I believe this was at Dalhousie, one former student described him sitting at his desk, and he was saying apparently Angus L. felt that the more students disagreed with one another in class, the more Angus encouraged it. So perhaps there's hope for us here that maybe there's some progress being made, even though sometimes we're disagreeing. And so Angus L., of course, he served as Premier of this province from 1933 to 1940. And he later became Federal Minister of Defence and oversaw the creation of the Canadian Navy and the Allied Convoy Service during World War II. And he passed away while he was still in office in 1954. And actually, that's a good point. I was just going to talk about some of the things that he did under his leadership.
Causeway needed surveyors.
And the member from Guysborough holds some resentment to this day for that causeway being built, because I know there was some economic development in the community of his constituency at that time, because there was a ferry running there. And there was, of course, a train that used to cross, and I can only imagine all the activity that would have been on to get a train across there every day, and probably multiple times a day, because in those days the steam engines couldn't carry as many cars. And I remember my father telling me that you'd see, even at a quiet railway station, perhaps in a community like Valley, you would see maybe 10 trains a day, whereas today you might see one, because it carried 10 times as many cars. But Angus L. spent quite a bit of, I shouldn't say the word spent, I think he invested a lot of money in paving of roads and building bridges and extending electrical transmission throughout the province. And one of the things we've seen in this, in our, not so long ago, we talk about history repeating itself. We just had a downturn in the economy where the federal government and of course the provincial government partnered to spend a lot of money on infrastructure. And what was Angus L. doing but the very same thing after the Great Depression to help address the mass unemployment? He was putting the jobless to work on highway projects. And he also was a visionary. He saw the need for what we would call today equalization, where he felt that the poorer provinces, needed a greater share of national tax revenues to pay for health, education, and welfare. And we see to this day that we benefit from those measures. And he also pointed out, and I should bring this back to the bill, Mr. Speaker, and I will in a moment, but I think it's important to point out that he pointed out at the time that Nova Scotia had gone from the richest province before Confederation to the poorest by the 1930s. Now, I know we've made gains since then, but he attributed this to policies made at the federal level that favored Ontario and Quebec and industries that were located there. And and I know the member had mentioned earlier about Canso Causeway linking Cape Breton Island to the mainland Nova Scotia.
That would have taken surveyors.
And that would have taken a lot of surveyors. And this act, I believe, was in force before the causeway was built. So no doubt the province was getting good value from the surveyors and perhaps saving on some of the potential conflicts that could have arisen had there not been a clear piece of legislation in force to ensure that the work activities and the surveying of that project were proceeding in an appropriate manner. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, may I ask how much time I have remaining?
Most certainly can. You have exactly 20 minutes left.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I look forward to continuing my remarks. I actually have numerous documents here, but perhaps I'll save them for another opportunity, which I may be able to stand up and speak in the House here. And I will do my best to keep it interesting. Another bridge, of course, and I mentioned it earlier, was the one that we have named after him in this province, the Angus L. MacDonald Bridge. And of course, this bridge, named in his honor, made it possible to travel between Halifax and Dartmouth, and without having to board the ferry or drive the distance around the Bedford Basin. And a little interesting story about the bridge, or about actually any of the bridges in the harbour. There was, and I don't want to go into this too much, but I do know that there's folklore, and I don't know if this is true, but there have been some discussion that there may have been a curse on the bridge, or on any bridge put across that harbour, that would have been put on by one of our people of Mi'kmaq, one of the founding peoples of the province, and we don't know if that's true. It might be. I know if going into the Gaelic culture, I know that we certainly have a belief in the supernatural, and my grandmother might call it a butchuck. She might say a butchuck was put on the bridge, and which is essentially a curse, and I presume that's an old Gaelic word. I've never seen it written. Of course, a lot of the Gaelic came across the pond, come across the Atlantic Ocean through oral transmission. And these words may be very old. But another word she used to use was the word thetiv. And I've seen many members in this assembly being thetiv from time to time when they perhaps stand up and they stick their chest out and they're speaking boisterously, because that's pretty much what thetiv means. It means somebody that's very confident and sure of themselves. And I remember her using that word in kind of a humorous way, where she might even see a little fellow or a little one parading around kind of like they owned the house, and she would say, "Well, look at that little fellow, isn't he thetiv?" And so I remember those words, and I miss them, Mr. Speaker, because I don't get to hear them anymore. She might have been speaking it to me, yes, but I do remember when I was younger, my father even used to use a lot of Gaelic words. He'd throw them in here or there, and you'd kind of get the gist of what they meant. And a member from Pictou East just referenced another expression in Gaelic and used the words puck, which is P-O-G, but in Gaelic, the G letter sounded like a C. So the word puck means kiss, and if we have a bar, we have a bar just up the street here, which is called the Pogue. And don't worry, I will get to the rest of the. I might do it word by word, but we have a bar up the street here called the Pogue, which I think is perhaps an abbreviation, if it could be related to the band. There was an Irish band called the Pogue Mahones. And in Irish Gaelic, it's very similar to Scottish Gaelic, but there's a little difference. And they, I don't know if they were surveyors, but I'm sure from time to time when a survey was being conducted, somebody might have said something such as Puck Mahan, if they weren't pleased with the results of the survey.
I would remind the honourable member that I am also from Cape Breton and my grandmother's of Gaelic descent, so I would bring your conversation back to the English language, please. Thank you. The honourable member for Inverness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, just for clarification for the House's benefit, the word puck means kiss and the word mo means my, but I will not tell you what the word han means. But perhaps if people want, they can look that up on the internet. And the member from Argyll has wisely suggested I turn my cheek on that one. But I did want to reference a member who was, he wasn't a member of the legislature, but he certainly held an important position in the House as Sergeant of Arms, and that was Noel Knockwood. And we have a portrait of him out in the House here. And he actually, getting back to the curse on the bridge, he actually removed that curse. And I won't go too much into the curse and why it was levied, because we don't know for sure, and I know some people don't believe in that kind of thing, but I know I do, because it's part of my culture, and I'm sure that Mr. Knockwood believes in it, otherwise he wouldn't have taken it upon himself to remove the curse. But I do apologize, Mr. Speaker. I probably should be trying to keep this more in line with the subject of at hand here. But I do know that those stories are probably more interesting, and I will try to come up with some further material there. But I know that stuff is probably more interesting than some of the stuff I'm going to speak about now. But when we look at surveying in the province and the contribution it makes to the economy, I was over in South Africa earlier this year. I made plans about 2 years ago to go to the World Cup. And the economy there, I was, of course, keeping a keen eye on some of the things I'm seeing. I love to travel, and I love seeing how other people do things. And when you travel and you pull yourself out of your element, you start to become more cognizant that the way we do things here isn't always the be-all and the end-all. And your mind opens up to the value of other people's ways of thinking. And one thing about South Africa is their population is growing, and they have very healthy population growth, and they've also got a lot of people who are starting to join the economy. And I was in a place called the Kingdom of Lesotho, which is in South Africa, but it's its own independent country. And when we crossed the border, there was, of course, the usual. Anytime you're crossing a border, in a lot of places throughout the world, they like to try to make you feel like you might be somebody who's bad, and they might try to make you fear about whether or not you're going to gain entry. But we got into the country, and I must say, the people there are incredibly friendly, very kind people, and they're doing well, and I think they've got a good future. And a lot of them move to places like Johannesburg, where they hope to gain employment. And you know, when you're driving on the highway around Johannesburg, you're going to see some nice cars. They like BMWs and Mercedes, and it's surprising to see people driving those kinds of cars, because there's more of them there than we see here, Mr. Speaker. But it's a sign that people are starting to participate in the economy, people who weren't allowed to participate in the economy during the time of apartheid. And of course, apartheid meant keeping people separate and keeping people apart. And there were all kinds of things. I want to go back to Lesotho and tie that back in. You know, there's people living there in the mountains. They live right off the land. They have, their children have the most beautiful smiles. They are kind people. I don't think there's a bad bone in their body from what I could see. And you think, you know, wouldn't it be nice for those people to have more wealth? Well, I tell you, they have a tremendous amount of wealth, of goodness in them, which is probably worth more than anything. and there's great happiness there, and that's the ultimate measure of success. But a lot of these people will come into Johannesburg, and outside Johannesburg there's a township called Soweto, which is short for Southwest Township, and this is where the black people were required to live. The Afrikaners that were there did not want them to be living in the same community, and much like the race relations in the US at one time, and of course there was activity here in Canada where people felt at the time that black people shouldn't be allowed to participate in the economy. They shouldn't be allowed to go to the same schools. And you know, Mr. Speaker, those are terrible things. I don't want to be too hard on the people who were responsible for those things. Maybe they were caught up in the day, but those measures were absolutely wrong. And anybody who tried to continue them and stop the progress of rights for minorities, and in this case, in South Africa, they were the majority. But anybody who is stopping that progress, terrible thing. And I watched a movie recently that, because having been there, this movie was very good, and if I think of it, I'll come back to the name of it another time, because the members might be interested in watching it. But in Soweto, I visited an area that of the township where there's a memorial to Hector Peterson. He was a young boy who was shot during a student protest march, and they were protesting because, and this is how deep the apartheid went. They would not let the children learn math in school because they didn't want them to have knowledge, because they knew by giving these young people knowledge, they were giving them power to overcome the oppression of the apartheid. But today, when I look in South Africa, we're seeing, I was in Pretoria, where if you were a black person 30 years ago, you better get on your way because you weren't welcome. And today, when I drove through the streets, I was the only white person that I could see. And that's a victory that it's good to see that country and those people sharing in their own success and being able to determine their future. One of the things I want to draw back to this bill and surveying, and this all gets back to the economy. And when we have a good bill like this, it helps to protect an industry. It improves the flow of business, and it contributes to GDP growth. We need that in Nova Scotia. If we look in South Africa, countries like South Africa are limited by the World Bank on how much they can borrow. And although that may slow down investment and progress, I think there's a positive side of that, because it means there's less liability and a healthier future. So if you take a country like South Africa, who is developing, and there are many people who are very poor there, who are trying to find a way in the economy to gain a better life for themselves, and they might not even be looking for themselves, they might be looking for their children. To be living in a country that's not laden with a lot of debt, there's a better future there for those people. And there's a better future for land surveyors. Thank you. I'd like to thank the... And I did table it. Yeah. And so just to focus on that point, Mr. Speaker, we have a lot of debt in this province. And, you know, we can all talk about how we got there, but the fact is we're there. And we should focus on how we're going to turn that around. And if I look at a country like South Africa, you know, the fact that they don't have that debt, it means they've got a better chance. And I hope they even, though they may have the temptation to spend money on creating bigger governments and whatnot, I hope they don't do that, because I think that that's one of the things that maybe have hurt our economy here in Nova Scotia, where we have, and I'm not putting the blame on anybody here, Mr. Speaker, where we have many people working in government. And yes, we need those people, and we don't want to be, we want everybody to have a chance to work. But when government grows too big, it starts to affect the rest of the economy. It would affect surveyors, it would affect the economic growth in the province, which of course, if we're talking about construction of buildings, or if we're talking about increased population because we've got people coming here to work because there are jobs here, and wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? We're going to have more need for surveying and more students coming to Nova Scotia. Want me to? And so that's why I bring up that point, Mr. Speaker. And so to wrap up now. So to conclude now, Mr. Speaker, on this bill, I thank you for the opportunity to being given a chance to speak on it. I do commend the government for bringing the bill forward. Commend the industry for their leadership in bringing it forward and leading the charge. And I wish them the best with the new legislation. And I hope that it helps Nova Scotia consumers with their surveying needs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thought maybe you were going to call it Dartmouth North like my honourable colleague from Argyll does all the time.
I do know the difference.
I am very pleased. Mr. Speaker, to stand in relation to Bill 124, an act respecting Nova Scotia land surveyors. And it's interesting to note that the survey that came out yesterday shows the Premier's approval rating at only 20%. So I'll table that. So that's got to be an interesting survey of the land in question. So that's from Angus Reid, and which puts him at, well, actually, he's right just above the HST where it is now, interestingly enough. But, you know, Mr. Speaker, as we were talking about the Act, and it's interesting how I note that my remarks yesterday, something I mentioned yesterday actually also relates to this Act. And what that Act is that I had mentioned that I thought it was an urban myth that you could walk across somebody's land carrying a fishing pole and then you weren't trespassing. Well, lo and behold, there are people that watch legislative television on their computers and so forth at home. And didn't I get an email right afterwards telling me exactly which Act? In fact, it isn't an urban myth. There is actually, in fact, legislation in Nova Scotia which allows you to do just that. And our legislative library kindly allowed or printed it off for me, and it actually relates to the Land Surveyors Act because the land does have to be surveyed, and it's not just fishing, Mr. Speaker. In fact, fishing, picnicking, camping, hiking, skiing, or engaged in any other recreational activity, or engaged in the study of flora and fauna, or hunting defined in the Wildlife Act is all reasons you can trespass without it actually being considered trespass. And Mr. Speaker, the interesting thing about that is, of course, if you are a land surveyor, you can't charge someone with trespass unless you know where the boundaries of the property are. Mr. Speaker, if I may quote for a second from the very fine book, The Surveyors of Canada, in its first, if I may just quote the first paragraph so I can set the stage for what it is we're talking about here. A nation must have surveyors to map its lands, chart its coasts, and locate its overland routes. For some time after Confederation, the surveys and mapping organizations of Canada grew slowly. At first, there were only the adventurous railway engineers and the eager men of the Geologic Survey at work investigating and recording the face of the land. Under Stanford Fleming, the railwaymen in government service, until their task ended in 1880, had reconquered most of the feasible overland routes. Well, Mr. Speaker, land surveying has come a long way since 1880, when Stanford Fleming, who we know is the originator of many of the on-time rail service, or mostly on-time rail service, and the clocks and Greenwich Mean Time and all those sorts of things that he had involvement in. It's come a long way. And so here we are replacing an act that was really hasn't been updated in any major way since 1989. With a new act, which I'm sure has the broad support of land surveyors, and the entire act, I'm sure, was well consulted with the surveyors and those who it would impact. That's certainly the way it seems to be, and I commend the Minister for his department for taking that approach. It makes a lot of sense. In fact, because one would not want to have provisions in a bill that don't relate to the title or really haven't been consulted on, like the rest of the bill. Mr. Speaker, so I do commend the Minister and his department on addressing that issue. Mr. Speaker, my honourable colleague from Halifax, Clayton Park, had talked about explanatory notes and so forth, and sometimes those are with the bill and sometimes they're not. In replacing an act, it actually would be interesting, and maybe the department has this, to have a this is what's included in the act and this is what is not included in the act, or this is what's been changed, sort of a crib notes of that, and because it's probably minor, so we've tried to look at those ourselves, and hopefully I get them right, and I apologize if I get them wrong. But one of the ones I might focus on, since I really probably only have a couple of minutes before we will be adjourning for the day, is the fact that GPS has become, obviously in 1989, other than the military, I doubt anybody really had a GPS around too much. And it's interesting to think about GPS, because one of the things I can recall around the time of the first Iraq War, that the U.S. government, who was running most of the satellites for GPS navigation at the time, had a built-in error correction of, if I remember correctly, was about 100 meters. And so using GPS as a tool for land surveying would have been pretty well useless. Your property line, imagine doing a city property line with a error of margin of 100 meters. You'd be 2 neighbors down the street from me. So, Mr. Speaker, obviously things have come a long way, and now, my goodness, Mr. Speaker, my cell phone out on Argyle Street will tell me I'm on Argyle or Barrington or wherever. Sometimes it's actually a little bit, sometimes it can go too far. In fact, I encourage, certainly on Facebook and Twitter and all those things, I turn the location service off. But if you're a land surveyor, it gives you the opportunity with cell phones and other things to actually follow the property line and do that. And I'd like to talk a little bit about, although I'll probably just introduce it and move on, is the Shubenacadie Canal Commission, because we've spent a lot of time trying to map those out. And recently, the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage and the Deputy Premier were kind enough to set up a meeting with me on the bill I have before the House on the Canal Commission, and the department has recommended some changes so it can be considered in the next session. And that, of course, requires some movement. Mr. Speaker, but I will tell that story at another time, and I know that we will have many hours of debate. At this point, Mr. Speaker, I would
ask if the honourable member would entertain adjourning debate at this time.
Well, I would be very pleased to, Mr. Speaker. I would move adjournment of this debate.
Thank you. The motion for adjournment has been made. All those in favour? Recorded vote has been called for. We will now ring the bells until for at least one. We will ring the bells now for at least 1 hour, or unless otherwise. Point of order, the Honourable Minister of Finance.
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker, the rules stipulate that to have a recorded vote, you have to have 2 members standing in their place, and neither of those things happened.
Thank you. That satisfied the chair, and I'll repeat myself again that we will now ring the bells for at least 1 hour, or unless earlier if the whips are satisfied. Thank you. Ring the bells.